In any case, we also have a speech by Tony Kevin in Canberra. He said, quote, "We live in dangerous times. US imperial power is flailing around in its death throes, making trouble for people and nations all over the world, blocking real action on climate change, trying to foment regime change in Venezuela and Iran, troublemaking in the South China Sea, illegally maintaining military presences in Syria. The US government elite remains obsessively Russophobic. The nuclear arms race is slipping out of control under dangerous American illusions of global military supremacy. We are living through the most perilous moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis, more perilous even since the craziness of Russiagate. The US government is not currently even speaking to Russia. And here in Australia, we have a crucially important election underway, whose outcome will be vital to our young people and other disadvantaged communities. So why bother about this person called Julian Assange, this one weird middle-aged guy who seems to have a knack for getting up the noses of so many powerful people and governments? Aren't there bigger things we need to think about other than the fate of this one particular troublesome person? Should we not just think of him as collateral damage of the past 20 years and move on to more important and current debates and causes? The fact that some of us are here today for this demonstration in a city not big on demonstrations shows we do not accept that argument. We recognize that Julian is pivotal to so much that is happening around us. In these dangerous times, we need to gather around him to protect him from his bitter enemies, not just because it is the decent thing to do, and it is, but because our country needs him, his idealism and energy and political insights. People like Julian are rare, and we need to give him our love and respect and loyalty and protection.
That city he mentions is Canberra, the capital of Australia, where there was a rally on Thursday in Australia, where Tony Kevin made these remarks, pretty extraordinary, tough remarks from a former Australian ambassador to Russia as well. And he's talking about, and will continue with his speech, as quote, "There is nothing here today that you won't guys know already. Here's an arguments flow freely around the internet. It is easy to like my Facebook and Twitter, to read and comment and encourage one another's work. We all know Julian's importance. That is why we are here. We could all be at home reading and writing on our iPads, but here we are in the public square in front of the UK embassy, HC, the embassy of America's most important lackey state, in the capital of city of America's second most important lackey state, Australia. We are gathered together just down the hill from our Parliament House, where Australian national security policy is debated and determined. The fact that we have come together in this place today, an act of real physical politics, sends an important message to our power elites. We want to make them uncomfortable. We want to be the burrs in their saddles. If we do that, we're achieving something here today. Julian is now in great danger. He faces extradition from Britain to the heartland of the American empire. They want to silence him, to bury him in US prison for the rest of his life, as they wanted to bury Chelsea Manning for 35 years, a sentence only commuted by Obama, an act of decency as he left office, to 9 years. As now, Manning is indefinitely back in jail again. She's a truly heroic person. The current US effort to extradite Julian, now exposed after years of denial, is an act of pure vengeance and spite, and intended to intimidate others who might be tempted to follow Julian's and Chelsea's noble examples. It is what apartheid South Africa did to Nelson Mandela. They failed to suppress his thought and nobility, and these people will fail too. Around the world, people are rising up in protest at the cruel political persecution now being inflicted on Julian and Chelsea. The US and UK secret states are throwing everything they can at Julian now. The full resources of Anglo-American information warfare, of the most malevolent psyops, psychological operations and warfare, have been deployed against this one man. Caitlin Johnstone, whose website I urge you to follow if you do not do so already, recently brilliantly listed and analyzed 27 big lies that are being spread about Julian and their efforts to discredit him and to limit the reach of his voice. Caitlin convincingly rebutted each of those lies. After today's event, please go and read her piece. It all boils down to a simple either-or proposition. Either Julian is crazy and dangerous and must be locked up for life, or those out to get him are committing evil acts. Maybe they're crazy and dangerous and need to be locked up for life. That's my insertion there. There can be no sitting on the fence on this one, no careful balancing of pros and cons on each side. We're talking about an innocent man's life and about the attempt by malign state forces to silence this great man's voice. Assange started with the idea that raw state power can and must be fought and exposed with truth and public opinion, that we must demand our governments behave decently, especially when they go to war. This is the same ideal that inspired Dan Ellsberg to leak the Pentagon Papers during the Vietnam War, Woodward and Bernstein to expose Nixon's Watergate crimes, Ed Snowden to expose the illegal U.S. government intelligence gathering on its own citizens, and Julian Assange to expose especially American war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. Nothing better shows the crucial importance of what Assange and Manning did than the release by WikiLeaks of the 18-minute film Collateral Murder, the full video and audio record of a mass murder of civilians carried out by a U.S. military helicopter over Baghdad. Not only did they murder a large group of unarmed, innocent civilians in the street, a few minutes later, they blew up an ambulance team and a bus that came to collect the bodies, and a few people still alive, a bus that even contained children. Correction, it wasn't an ambulance, it was some civilians acting like an ambulance. And they enjoyed themselves, they congratulated themselves on their marksmanship. They gloried in these cruel murders. None of these war criminals were ever brought to justice, nor ever will be. The video was suppressed until Manning somehow got it out to WikiLeaks. This was whistleblowing in the public interest of the highest order. If WikiLeaks had done nothing else, this film proved its vital importance. WikiLeaks has opened the gates to a whole new way of challenging the imperial state and its false propaganda. This is a healthy public skepticism out there. There is a healthy public skepticism out there. Lies are being and will be challenged and exposed. Excuse me. Julian and his team showed the way to the heroism of our own witness Kay and Bernard Colleray in this city over the Australian government's illegal spying during an important negotiation with the East Timor government, a case with which you will all be familiar, at least all those at that demonstration in Canberra, maybe not our international audience. Mainstream media are more and more being forced to account for themselves, to look critically at their own role in normalizing and explaining away state misconduct. People like us, however, angry we might make people like Chris Ullman and Michael Rowland, and I like and respect them both as good mainstream journalists, Australian journalists, have an essential role to play in holding a blowtorch to the feet of power and to those who surround and protect and normalize power.
And I just want to insert, before I continue with Tony Kevin's amazing speech, I just want to add on the collateral murder piece that it is amazing the impact that that had, not just because of the fact that images themselves are visceral, they elicit a visceral response, but because unlike other WikiLeaks publications, you don't have to sit and pour through hundreds of thousands of documents to access the entirety of that publication. So I think that also made it uniquely important. So, but continuing with Tony Kevin's speech, he says, quote, "Finally, what message can we send today to help Julian? We wish he were here in this little piece of British territory across the road called the UK High Commission. We wish we could go in there and bring him out to freedom, as British police brutally dragged him out of another embassy to a different kind of jail, a British prison in London. But we can send a powerful message. We need to demand of the British government, and I hope people are listening to us in there, these things." And he says in parentheses, "I have sent them a copy of these words." Then he continues saying, "First, fair and decent conditions of imprisonment in Belmarsh prison, as Julian awaits legal proceedings and during these proceedings. Proper accommodation, access to fresh air and sunlight and exercise, proper medical care, adequate visiting rights by his family, friends and legal team, and regular and reported consular visits from the Australian High Commission consular staff. All of these things are basic human rights due to any Australian citizen imprisoned in a foreign country. Our government needs to demand these things, as it did for James Ricketson in Cambodia, for Peter Greste in Egypt, for our footballer in Thailand, but did not do for David Hicks and Mamdouh Habib in the US, and until recent days was not doing for Julian. We need to challenge the complacent assumption of our government, Labour opposition, and the mainstream media that bad stuff cannot be done to Australian citizens by the governments of our great and powerful friends, Britain and the United States. It can be, and it is. Secondly, and crucially, we need to demand our political elites, in this case, Foreign Minister Marise Payne and her shadow, Penny Wong, and behind them, the major party leaders, Scott Morrison and Bill Shorten, that they strenuously and forcefully demand of the British government that it not allow Julian to be extradited to the United States. We know what will happen to him there. We see what is done to political prisoners of conscience, Chelsea Manning and Maria Butina. We cannot allow this to happen to Julian, to become a lifetime political prisoner of conscience in a United States jail. We need to demand of Marise Payne and Penny Wong that they publicly and jointly or separately commit to making the strongest representations to the British government to bring Julian safely home to Australia after his bail issue is legally concluded in the United Kingdom. His extradition to the US must be firmly denied because it is entirely vindictive and political exemplary punishment. We cannot trust American justice in this matter. We must protect Julian now so that he can return to safety and resume public interest work in his home country, Australia. We are proud of our fellow Australian, and we must now stand by him in his hour of greatest need. Thank you. And that is the end of Tony Kevin's speech in Canberra, as we mentioned earlier, on the 26th of April this year. So,
as well, maybe people are sick of my voice, so that might be a good thing. That was a very extraordinary speech, and it's very hard to follow up and say anything more than that. There's not much more that Tony didn't say there, and say it very, very well. And this, again, is from a senior ambassador, former ambassador of Australia. And it occurred to me that the only thing that moves politicians to do anything is the fear that they may lose their job. And that means being voted out. So this somehow has to become an issue, an electoral issue in Australia, the fate of Assange. For members of parliament, for those who are in the cabinet, this is got to be a number one issue. And I don't know how many people showed up at that rally. I'm hoping it was large, because that's the only way we're going to get any kind of politician anywhere in the world where there's some semblance of democracy called an election to do a damn thing about this. Because they're not going to act on principle. You know, Tony Kevin is acting on principle here. He has nothing to gain from doing this, and probably a lot of grief from his former colleagues and people in the government he might know still from his days when he was in the government. So it's got to be somehow made clear to these folks that, in the US too, by the way, that particularly the chief guy is sitting in the White House, that he has to do something to help Assange, or he could be hurt. We heard last week, if you remember, Elizabeth, from Lee Stranahan, who has abandoned his support for Trump. He abandoned his support for Trump because of what happened to the arrest. And he claimed that there were like 20%, I don't know, that wasn't scientific, but in his view, about 20% of Trump's supporters have abandoned him because of the arrest of Assange. So this has to be made to be a firm electoral issue on both sides of the Pacific, both sides of the Atlantic,